IDC Radio,
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
IDC Radio, in collaboration with כל ישראל.
106.2 FM.
IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. I'm Itai Hanman and joined in studio with some very special guests from the Subterranean Challenges in War and Peace Conference that is taking place here at the IDC. We're going to have a little panel discussion with our guests about underground threats, past and future trends. With us in studio right now is John Spencer. He is the chair of the Urban Warfare Studies Modern War Institute at West Point, and Major Haley Mercer of the U.S. Army. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start off with a little basic question about the conference, and what do you both look forward to gaining from such a conference, since it is the first one of its kind in the international arena?
For me, I'm more of a practitioner, and I focus on the operational level implications of subterranean operations. So what I find very interesting in the conference thus far is the legal implications and the historical trends. I don't have a legal background, and I don't consider myself a historian. So those two areas I find very interesting.
Yeah, so similar to me, I'm just trying to be a sponge. And then that's what the amazing part of this conference Daphne's been able to bring so many different disciplines together. I focused on urban warfare, so I study a lot of the underground of the urban spaces. But, all the different speakers we've had, whether it's a geologist, understanding having this certain underground environment that allows for tunnels, and maybe you should be watching out for it, to the issues with cross-border invasion of sovereignty. I'm just trying to be a sponge.
There's a lot to learn, and
Yeah.
I have to say it is quite interesting how the conference came together and brought multiple disciplines. We have academics, we have practitioners, we have geologists, we have psychologists. There is a whole range of disciplines here to try to really give a full focus and encompass all that goes into subterranean warfare. I think that's something very interesting I want to touch on with you, Major Mercer, specifically as a practitioner. When looking at subterranean warfare as a whole, how does the psychological aspect come into play there, thinking about soldiers entering a tunnel to clear it or to know that the potential enemy can pop out from anywhere underneath you? How does that play psychologically into the actual soldiers' work in the field?
There's no doubt that I think they think about it, but I don't think it's any different than any of the other threats that they face. So at the tactical level, I don't think there's that much of a difference. I think you do see a larger difference at the operational level.
And when you look at it, what would you say is the major difference between tactical and operational then?
So the main difference is going to be when you're thinking of a subterranean threat at the operational level is how you design, plan, and execute operations against a subterranean threat. So I think that's where the deeper, more perilous threat lies, is at the operational level. You can win battles at the tactical level, but the tactical level doesn't win wars. It's really at the operational level that links the tactical and strategic levels.
And Mr. Spencer, as we look at the urban warfare as a whole, and that is something that you focus on and that you are in charge of at the Modern War Institute at West Point. How do tunnels come into play in modern urban warfare, specifically when we see major cities and they already have cities underneath the cities, basically? I come from Canada where in the wintertime we basically live underground a lot of the time, and we have half of our cities are underground. We travel in the downtown where I'm from completely underground in foot, not even subways and things like that. So, what type of challenges are posed to militaries now and to counterterrorist experts when looking at the urban landscape as a whole and knowing that there's now an entire new battlefield right underneath them?
Yeah, so that's a lot there, and that's the beauty of starting this conference off, and hopefully it's repeated multiple times. And the starting up of the International Working Group is a big part of that. I mean, you can't separate, and that's kind of why I'm here. You can't separate underground warfare from urban warfare, as the world has become more urban. And there's some people even in our conference who are having this debate on, just because the world is becoming more urban, why do you think that conflict will become more urban? And it's like, 'cause that's what the data is showing. I mean, if you look at the last 5, 6, 10, 15 years, and you take all the battles that have happened, whether it's in Iraq or Syria, they're all urban. And they've all had a major explosion of the underground component of that. You could argue that we've driven warfare into urban spaces and we've driven warfare underground, because the underground does provide a defender of an urban area to negate some of the advantages of most modern militaries, the ability to see you, the ability to attack you from overhead. The underground gives that person an advantage, and that's what we've seen. I mean, underground warfare, of course, you know from being at the conference, but maybe listeners don't. It goes back to the beginning of warfare in general, from the Jewish revolt of the Romans to you name a battle. There's an underground component of it. But underground warfare has had inflection points. It had inflection points during siege warfare of the 15th, 16th century. It inflected during trench warfare of World War I. And all of a sudden now, in the last 5 years, every battle, Raqqa, Mosul, Kobani, Mawari, they've all had a major underground component of that. And when it comes into militaries, that means that we must adapt to the character of warfare or the inflections. And we need to start thinking about this from the tactical, operational to the strategic. I mean, strategic's hard to argue, but one of the things that I talked about at the conference was tunnel bombs. So the ability to tunnel underneath somebody and explode them. You could see how that could have a strategic effect depending on what the objective or where they struck. And it's a pretty simple ancient tactic, but we've seen it explode in 45 tunnel bombs in 2 years. As a former military guy, but as an academic now studying warfare, that's something we have to listen to and be prepared for, which means militaries have to prepare for it, both in planning and in operations and training for it. You asked that question about why is it different. As an old infantry guy, I would never want to go down a tunnel, and I don't want to fight in urban areas. But the problem is that the world has changed, and that's going to happen.
I think one thing that makes this urban warfare and subterranean operations today much different than it was, say, hundreds of years ago, is that today we're more observable, predictable, and understandable than ever before, the world as a whole. And so while it's still a critical part of the equation, superior military strength is no longer a guaranteed formula for victory. And the 21st century battlefield is more complex than ever, and it now requires a new way of thinking. And so we must begin to seek answers beyond the simplistic perceptions from our past experiences or heuristics and expertise in order to shape the deep fight against a subterranean threat.
And you brought up historical context, both of you, and I think it's very interesting. And lessons learned, that's something that we always need to take away from. And especially people with military backgrounds have a very deep understanding of debriefing and the lessons learned and needing to learn from past operations, mistakes, even successes, whatever it may be. And I think something that's very interesting that pops up specifically when people talk about subterranean warfare, tunnels, etc., and they look for some sort of modern contemporary effect or something that happened in the past that they can look to learn from. And I think something that at least this generation looks to and not too far back would be the Vietnam War. What differences do you guys see now specifically in the fights that happened in Iraq and compared to the tunnels that were being fought in Vietnam?
Great. Yeah, so great question. for me, there's differences. One in the use of the tunnels. So as we talked about today at the conference, there are many types of tunnels, from tunnels that are hand dug, rudimentary tunnels for strictly military purposes, to, like we talked about, urban warfare. You're going to have hundreds of miles of urban infrastructure, subway tunnels, metro tunnels, all of that. So Vietnam, the use of tunnels was more of a defensive purpose. So the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army dug massive tunnel complexes, mostly to be able to hide their movements, hide portions of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, sometimes to come up from underneath and do attacks. But what we've seen, the difference in today's tunnel warfare goes back, the more ancient examples. Like I said, the ability they're tunneling underneath whether it's their enemy, the other force, and attacking, or so they're doing both what the Viet Cong was doing, which is avoiding the explosions from above, right? If I can see you, I can strike you with artillery, which was what happened, Vietnam, massive bombing. So they just go underground, and they would be deep underground and protected. So they put their headquarters underground. And we're seeing all that, but also we're seeing more as invasion tunnels, which are popping up on not just here. I mean, it's a pretty legitimate threat here, tunnels into Israel, northern Israel, but it's the same thing in Syria, in Iraq, invasion tunnels, or tunnels, like I said, to tunnel underneath you and explode you, which hasn't been seen in a long time.
I think one trend that we see consistently from Vietnam to Korea to even today is leveraging the civilian sector for materials and digging expertise. So I think that's a trend that we'll continue to see as the subterranean threat continues to be an important issue.
And how did warfare change or adapt to tunnels in that sense, specifically now in the Iraq, Syria arenas?
So I think it makes there's two parts to that. I think, and that's some of the so at this conference we don't have a lot of answers. We have a lot of questions.
It's the most important.
And a lot of the
Starts
questions
the
are
discussion.
legal because I think it's legitimate. The law of land warfare has certain overriding regulations to armed conflict that haven't changed, but there have been small changes. So most of the time you're talking about, is there a change if we're going to fight underground and the enemy, whether they're following international rules of armed conflict or not, but that doesn't matter. The liberal dilemma, or the dilemma is, you're going to fight under the rules of law. So does going underground change that? Does it change what you can do? And then we look to historical contexts. What did we do about the tunnels of Vietnam? And can we replicate those things now, or have we implemented, are those still just measures to basically to deal with those tunnels? As now we've seen, they're popping up everywhere, especially in these urban, I call them sieges. So the enemy has entered urban areas because they know that anybody who's going to attack them is going to follow the laws of land warfare, and they're going to intermix between civilians, so they're going to restrict the force that can be used against them. So they're literally sieging themselves within urban areas, and then somebody has to come get them out.
We saw that in the Philippines.
Yeah, saw it in the Philippines, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Syria, we're still seeing it in Syria. I mean, it makes sense that a weaker enemy will go into there, and like Haley said, I mean, it's going to negate some superior military force and not level the playing field, but give them more chances, I guess.
Right. So like what you were saying, going underground almost does it level the playing field and negate some of our superior military strength. At the division level, at the operational level, we shape the deep fight for our subordinate units. And one way we do that is through our lethal fires effects. But if you have a subterranean enemy, you can't shape the deep fight with our lethal fires if they're impervious to our lethal fires effects. So what we have to do is think about other ways that we can shape the deep fight against an enemy that's underground.
And I think one thing that doesn't get noticed too much in the media specifically, but when reading or looking at urban warfare and subterranean warfare, nobody really talks about how much effort is really put into avoiding civilian casualty, following the laws of war when going into these specific scenarios. I think very interestingly, we've seen now Egypt on the Gaza border as well deal with tunnels from Gaza into Egypt. A lot of them more smuggling tunnels than terrorist offensive capability tunnels. However, they've been dealing with it by flooding those tunnels, literally with seawater and flooding them as far, even sewage water has been pumped in there. And looking at that, that's not something that gets airtime, but at the same time, it's a innovative way, I guess, to destroy the tunnels. What other innovative ways, while following the rules of law, do you think that can be applied now to tunnel warfare that hasn't necessarily been applied yet?
That's a hard question. It's so we as a former military guy, I mean, it's mission specific. Okay. So what is if we're talking about warfare, armed conflict, and what's the mission? And then the subterranean is an environment that you would encounter. But your mission is usually not to go down into the subterranean environment. Usually it's part of whatever the mission is, like reclaim a city. It could be in cross-border tunnels. It could be just to keep your borders secure. So now your mission is, well, I need to neutralize or block this tunnel so it's no longer a threat to that mission. So if you're a border patrol and you found a tunnel, the mission is to not let people come in through the border. But if your mission is to clear a city of enemy personnel, then you're talking about, okay, now I have to determine, well, one, I have to find the tunnel, and then do I have to clear it or not? And that's some of the conversations in the context for me. It's all about context and mission. But so the context of, okay, what are you going to do about that underground tunnel? And the questions here are, do you know for sure that it is an enemy tunnel? Do you know for sure that there are no civilians down there? And that's where all these questions that we're asking here. In Haley said, do you already know in advance of your mission that they're going to be present so that you can prepare subordinate leaders to deal with them? Can you help them before they get there? And then it bleeds into training before you go and all that stuff.
Well, and I think while tactical solutions are important and we must think about them, tactical solution is only good for a moment in time until the enemy adapts and counters that tactical solution. So that's why I really think we need to address this issue at the operational level and think beyond a tactical solution.
I know we're running up against the clock here, so I'm just going to ask a couple last questions here. I wanted to ask your guys' opinion. How does a military specifically that is fighting different types of wars, be it against terrorists, be it against non-state actors like terrorists, or a state actor with a major military force? And really, I'm looking at two major threats that face the world, and one being North Korea, the other being, again, the terrorists. And we see that they both use tunnels to their advantage. When planning potential conflict versus either of these types of enemies, does a lot of different planning need to go into, okay, this is a tunnel dug by the North Korean military and would be used by North Korean military, versus this is an Al-Qaeda tunnel and a bunch of Al-Qaeda terrorists are going to use it? Is the mindset, is the planning that goes into it very different?
I would say it's a little different. When you begin your plan and you think about the cognitive design aspects, you really need to understand the threats. You need to understand the relationships between their values, morals, and beliefs, and truly understanding the enemy when you begin your design process. And then once you really understand the threat, then you can nest in your virtual effects and physical effects to shape that subterranean threat.
I'd say absolutely. One, there's absolutely a difference between preparing for combat operations or a fight with North Korea. Not that we would ever want that to happen, but when they have underground cities, and they've been digging for decades, they've been digging because it negates most of the threats that are against them from strikes. And if you talk about terrorists' use of the tunnels, it's different. But So I argue the military's designed themselves for an ideal that they have is the biggest threat in the most likely environment. So I, as an urban warfare scholar, said that better include an urban fight, and it better include underground fighting. So both of those would then back you up to how you design military forces. everything from their doctrine to the organization to the types of units. It better include urban training and underground training.
Well, that is very, very interesting, sobering, and enlightening. I appreciate both of your guys' time. It's been a very interesting discussion with Mr. John Spencer, Chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at Modern War Institute at West Point, and Major Haley Mercer of the U.S. Army. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule here at the Subterranean Challenges in War and Peace Conference, and look forward to the rest of the day's activities. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.